Welcome to Reconquest on the Crusade Premium Channel, part of the Veritas Radio Network. This is Brother André Marie coming to you from St. Benedict Center in Richmond, New Hampshire. Our websites are catholicism.org and reconquest.net. My email address, should you like to send me a quick note, comment, or question, is bam@catholicism.org. That's bam@catholicism.org. You can find me on social media. I'm on Twitter at brother_Andre, and I'm easily discoverable on Facebook. If you just search for Brother André Marie, you will find me there. This evening's episode is episode number 226, and we're calling it Integralism and the Common Good of the Community. My guest is the esteemed English Dominican friar, Father Thomas Crean, OP, that's Order of Preacher. And he is the author of a recent book entitled Integralism, a Manual of Political Philosophy, which he co-authored with another gentleman whose name is not in front of me right at the moment. I'm sorry, Alan Fimister. And Mr. Fimister is a professor at a seminary here in the United States. Father Crean is coming to us from Cornwall in England. And Father Crean is the author of other books as well, published by Ignatius Press. And those would be God is No Delusion, which was a response to the God delusion. And then The Mass and the Saints, also published by Ignatius Press. But again, the book that we're going to be discussing now is called Integralism, a Manual of Political Philosophy. And by the way, longtime listeners would perhaps remember that I've interviewed Father Crean before, and that would have been on episode 161 when we talked about Adam and Eve before the fall. So without any further ado, I'll bring on Father Crean. Good evening, Father Crean. How are you today?
Good evening, brother. I'm very well, thank you.
Very good. And thank you for taking the time to be interviewed and share your wisdom with us. I appreciate it very much.
Well, thanks for having me on.
You're welcome. So the first question, of course, that presents itself when you consider the subject of integralism or integrism, which is another name for the same thing, is what is it? So in a nutshell, could you tell us what it is?
Yes, well, integralism, or as you say, integrism, is used in two slightly different senses. One, a more philosophical sense, in the sense of emphasizing the importance of St. Thomas for the correct presentation of the truths of the faith. The other related sense, which is the one that we're talking about tonight, is really simply emphasizing the social kingship of Christ. So I would say that integralism, even though the word is very new, or relatively new, I think it's a early 20th century coinage, just means the principles that underlie Christendom. So it's just a shorthand for the principles that did underlie Christendom when it existed, and the principles that will underlie any Christendom when please God, Christendom is rebuilt.
Okay. So the implications here are that Christ the King, as ruler of all societies, including not only the church but also of civil society, of the temporal order, has authority over the entire. He has dominion that is universal, and therefore it extends into every facet of life, including those facets that we tend to think of as under the authority of temporal rulers, including the law, including international relations, including family life, including economics. So all of these are subject to the moral law. Therefore, all of them are also subject to Christ the King. Is that a fair way of saying it?
Yes, exactly. Another way of, I suppose, of defining the term would be to say that it refers to the union of the temporal and the spiritual power. Perhaps a bit more precisely, you could say the hierarchical union of the temporal and the spiritual power. So there's in that sense, it's a golden mean between two extremes, as all virtues are. So on the one hand, one extreme would be the separation of spiritual and temporal. On the other hand would be the separation of spiritual and temporal is least theoretically, what's going on in the modern world post French Revolution. And on the other hand, the other extreme would be the merging of the spiritual and temporal, so that no difference is made between them, and that, at least as I understand it, is what is characteristic of Islam.
Yeah.
So Christendom is the mean and the high point between those two low points and extremes.
So, okay. So to just kind of flesh that out a little bit, or to make it maybe more concrete for our listeners, the one erroneous extreme would be the sort of Jeffersonian separation of church and state.
Right.
Whereby the spiritual and the temporal orders are severed and not connected. The other is kind of like a Muslim society like Iran or some caliphate in the Islamic world, where the church is the state. The two are inseparable. They're not even logically distinguished. They're just the same entity. Okay, so, and that is, by the way, you say that's your understanding of the Islamic world. That is my understanding of the Islamic world too. And my deceased mentor, who came from the Arab world, assured me that was indeed the case. So then we understand what integralism is. Now, there are many people who, first of all, progressivists, of course, make themselves enemies of integralism. I understand that I hate to bring up the fact that he was a Dominican, but I think Yves Congar was kind of an implacable enemy of integralism. And as I understand it, integralism kind of has if you're called an integraliste in certain French Catholic circles, it's kind of a bad word, huh?
Yes, my impression is that the word intégriste, so integrist, is probably more often used as the pejorative term, but
I see.
I'm not certain if that's the case, but that's my impression. But whether historically anybody's drawn any kind of distinction and said that one is better than the other, I'm not aware of any. But,
okay.
Yes. So someone like Father Congar. I would imagine that he would have been much in the same line as Pope Paul VI and Maritain, who didn't condemn the idea of Christendom, but thought that it was something whose day had passed, and that a better way lay open for the human race to follow.
And of course, you would disagree with that.
Yes, I think it was. At best a naive idea, but also I think it was more fundamentally erroneous in that I think it depended on a form of anonymous Christianity. So on an idea that people can be justified without knowing Christ, or at least without explicitly believing in Christ.
Actually, that's quite interesting that you would say that, because immediately you connect two concepts that I didn't expect that you would say that, and I'm not saying you wouldn't have. I just you came right to that point. You bring up a subject that's dear to my heart, because you're connecting religious indifferentism to this false doctrine, this ideology of the separation of church and state, that Christ the King doesn't need to reign practically over the temporal order. It's distinct from the temporal order, and that the logical foundation for that and the logical consequence of it is indifferentism. Yes,
so Maritain, for example, he was aware of the doctrine of the social kingship of Christ, and in his very famous book, very influential book, Integral Humanism, he explains how he thinks he can deal with that. And it's basically, it's because people are, in his view, able to be subjecting their lives to Christ without knowing it, because they're justified anonymously by a sort of love for the good, a love for the noble good. And on his view, without realizing it, this is actually their adherence to divine revelation. So, and in that sense, they're fulfilling the natural law and therefore serving Christ the King. So that's Maritain's attempt to reconcile his his rejection of Christendom as an aspiration with the social kingship of Christ. But
and that's sort of that's the Karl Rahner doctrine of the anonymous Christian that lay at the heart of that, and also the idea that grace is somehow implicit in nature.
Yes, Maritain has a slightly different doctrine, I think, from Rahner himself, but it is nevertheless a form of anonymous Christianity.
Okay.
And it's, theoretically, Maritain did clearly distinguish nature and grace, and so he always defended the doctrine of limbo, which is quite rare among people who were in his sort of. It was quite rare among people who don't have a clear idea of the necessity of explicit faith in Christ for salvation. So in that sense, he was very traditional. But on this particular case of anonymous Christianity, he was very untraditional.
I see.
And he needed that for his attempt to unite a theoretical acceptance of the social kingship of Christ with a pluralist society as his ideal.
So if the temporal order is made up of people who are trying to live virtuously according to the natural law, a hypothetical case if there ever was one, then that would be good enough for Maritain.
Because he thinks that such people, in fact, would be in a state of grace, and they would be justified even they just didn't know it.
Okay. So, and just for the record, in case the audience hasn't picked up on it, we're against that, or I am, and you've already declared yourself
I'm also against that.
Okay, all right, very good. So now that we've defined integralism and kind of seen, and by the way, I think we should mention there are a lot of people, at least in the United States, who consider themselves conservative Catholics, even traditionalists, who perhaps because of our American prejudices are, with our American imperialism, however you want to say it, American exceptionalism, and the Americanism that often lay just beneath the surface of any kind of Catholicism in the United States, we tend to think that the political ideal is a separation of church and state, even if we think that the society should be sort of generally informed by Christian principles. I've run into people, including friends and former friends, who mock the idea of integralism and make it sound as if we're far better off with the separation of church and state, especially given the, well, let's just put it plainly, the mess that we have in the ecclesiastical hierarchy today. That if we attempted to have an integralist or an integral Catholic culture, an integral Catholic temporal order, we'd be far worse off because people who are otherwise free to do good things would be kind of prevented from doing them by a newly empowered episcopacy that now has all of the civil authority, not completely in its hands, obviously, because there is that legitimate distinction, but they would have far more influence in the temporal order than they currently do. So that's there. I mean, some of my listeners may be of that mind, and some of and certainly my listeners would have been exposed to people who are of that mind. A friend of mine, a former president, however he characterizes himself, a man named John Zmirak, has written very, very pointedly against any kind of integralism because of precisely this thing. He buys into the American ideal, perhaps unknowingly, as kind of a disciple of Maritain, but. So that's there as well. But anyway, most traditionalists, I think, are genuinely for this kind of integral Catholic temporal order, as well as, a good Orthodox ecclesiastical order. So the two should be firing sort of on all cylinders together for an ideal society, like, say, St. Louis, the King of France in the 13th century, in the High Middle Ages. So what I thought that we could do, Father, is to drill down a little bit into some specificity about what is the common good, and then perhaps we could from there talk about how the common good is realized in an integral Catholic temporal order. You and your co-author, Mr. How does he say his name? Fimister?
Yes, that's right.
Okay, Mr. Fimister, you very handily and I think helpfully append at the end of each chapter a series of theses in good sort of Thomistic, scholastic fashion. You have these theses stuck at the end of each chapter, which kind of recapitulate the information and sort of concentrate the information that was in the chapter preceding these theses. And what I thought we could do is maybe go through the list of theses that you have about the common good. But first, before we get to that, could you tell us what the common good is? This is one of those catchphrases that's used and abused a great deal today. People, I think, don't understand what the common good is. They tend to mistake it with shared goods, and there's a lot of mischief that happens under the term common good. So could you give us some clarity on that, Father?
Yes. So I think the simplest definition of the of a common good, first of all, is to say that it's a good that can be possessed entirely by more than one person. Mm-hmm. And in that sense, it's distinct from a private good. So an example of a private good would be something like a cake. I can possess a cake myself, and I can share it with you. But if I share it with you, then we've only got half each. So we don't entirely possess the same cake. Uh-huh. So that's a private good. But a common good is one that can be shared entirely by more than one person. So, for example, a philosophical discussion, such as we're having now, would be a common good because it's not possessed entirely by one person, or rather, it's possessed entirely by all those who are taking part in it. And if a third person joins in, then that doesn't mean that the two of us, have a lesser share in the good that we are participating in, which is in this case the good of truth. But it means that a third person is contemplating the same truths along with us. Or perhaps an easier example would be somebody looking at a painting. So if somebody's looking at a painting and somebody else comes and joins him, then that doesn't diminish his own appreciation of the painting. In fact, it may well increase his appreciation of the painting because somebody is enjoying it with him.
So the things that
so basically, you could say that anything which is spiritual, like truth or beauty or goodness, those are things that can be participated in by many without being diminished. Whereas anything which is material, like a cake, can only be participated in by many by being diminished.
You're listening to Reconquest on the Crusade Premium Channel, part of the Veritas Radio Network. And this is Brother André Marie. I'm interviewing Father Thomas Crean, the English Dominican friar. And we're speaking of integralism and the common good of the community. So just to sort of recap, the common good is a common good, is a good that can be shared by people, and in sharing it, it's not diminished. No matter how, all of us can enjoy the totality of that good without diminishing it.
Exactly. So
this applies to truth, goodness, and beauty, and it applies to faith, hope, charity, any kind of spiritual good.
Right. So that's the common good as in the abstract, and then you could say the common good concretely is the participation of any given society in these good things. So the extent to which a given society participates in truth, in virtue, in beauty, is primarily what we should mean by the common good of that society. And in the world in which we actually live, when we've been called to the life of grace, then the very highest common good of the society is God himself, in whom we participate by grace. So that I would say is the pure philosophical idea and theological idea of the common good. It tends to get, in a way, downgraded in common speech to the material things that are shared by many people, especially material things that are public in a given society, like railways or libraries or roads or traffic lights or the internet or something, or things like that.
Yeah. Or a universal income.
Sorry?
Or a universal income, as some socialists want to have in the United States.
Okay, so that would be a theoretical way of organizing the economy, but even if that was a good thing to do, which it isn't, then it wouldn't be the common good, and it would just be at most be a means to people being able to participate in spiritual goods more easily.
Now, because it happens that there is obviously we're hylomorphic beings. We're a combination or a joining of body and soul. There's something about man that is temporal because he's corporeal, he's bodily. There's something about him that's spiritual because he has the spiritual faculties of intellect and will, and therefore there's always this sort of necessary juncture of these two orders of things. And even when we talk about material things, we have to talk about them in terms of using them virtuously. So when we speak of the life of virtue, it includes how we use material things, doesn't it?
Yes, so insofar as there is a organization of material things which is resulting from or conducive to the life of virtue, in that kind of sense, they contribute towards the common good. So, for example, if someone burns down a library, then you can say they're harming the common good, and that's because they're making it harder for people to, the members of that society, to acquire knowledge, and knowledge being something spiritual is properly speaking part of the common good of that society.
On the other hand, if somebody, by his munificence, endows some sort of a professorial chair at a university whereby somebody like you can now teach people knowledge that they wouldn't have otherwise had, that person is contributing to the common good, even though he's used material means to do so, correct?
Yeah, exactly. So, as you say, we're a union of body and soul, and as Aristotle would say, material things, including the body, are necessary as tools for achieving happiness, and that's true whether we're talking about natural happiness, as Aristotle was, or the supernatural beatitude that ultimately all societies have to be directed to in order to be well-ordered societies.
Now, if the temporal society has to be ordered to our, and I guess this really cuts to the heart of what integralism is, what the ideals of integralism are. That as I understand integralism, what defines it is that the temporal order, because man participates in the temporal order, it has to be ordained to man's final end, because the man our final end is the first in intention, but it's the last in execution. And the temporal society to which we belong ought to be ordered not only to the immediate end of our life in this world, but also to our ultimate end, which is eternal beatitude.
Yes, exactly, and there's all kinds of reasons why that's necessary, I would say. And we sort of go backwards and forwards between different reasons in the course of the book. One way of thinking about it is just to say that God's plan is ordered. So God doesn't have two unrelated plans. And so if he wills that we live together in temporal society, that must have something to do with his ultimate purpose for us, which is to live with him in heaven. And obviously it can't be God's will that living together in temporal society should be a hindrance to reaching heaven. That would make God's will absurd. So it must be God's will that living together in temporal society, and therefore the laws and customs and institutions that govern that living together should be consciously directed towards heaven as their ultimate goal. So that's one way of thinking about it. Another point that we make at various places in the book is that temporal society can't even succeed on its own terms without revelation. And that's because we're fallen. So we can't keep the natural law, and therefore we can't achieve natural happiness by the power of our fallen nature. So even to reach the end for which exists, the immediate end for which exists, that's to say natural happiness in this world, temporal society requires revelation and grace. So it requires that the laws know what revelation is and know what the channels of grace are, and that our rulers therefore defend the channels of grace and defend revelation against error. Otherwise, our society is going to fail even on its own terms as a political society seeking for natural happiness in this world.
And I think, Father, that what you just said, which is an excellent point about the natural law not being on its own terms, a temporal society trying to achieve its own ends of temporal happiness can't do that on its own terms, is so easily provable historically. And at the time of the Founding Fathers in the United States, they generally believed in the institution of marriage, yet the social contract theory that many of them had imbibed from English authors such as Hobbes, for instance. I'm not sure what Locke said about this, but Hobbes definitely, and you got in your book, reduced marriage to just some sort of a purely civil contract that was dissoluble. So as soon as you admit some kind of social contract theory, you cut through you dispense with what marriage actually is, and you dispense with the traditional, classical, and certainly the natural law idea of what men are doing in a society, and it's a progressive, or I should say, it's a regressive thing because we degenerate into where we are now. At least the Founding Fathers had some concept of virtue. Today, most people don't even think that virtue has anything to do with the way we're governed or the way that we live in temporal society. And we can, of course, see that in the actors and athletes and politicians and other luminaries that we make the sort of the ascended masters of our society. The people who get all of the celebrity in our society are generally people who, can't stay married, and at the very least don't live the life or pursue the life of virtue as an ideal even. So I mean, you have a whole chapter in your book on the family, and you talk. It's interesting. You talk about this interplay that exists between the good of society, which is greater because it's the greater of a larger number of people. It's a higher goodness than the good of the individual. Yet it exists also for the preservation of the good of the individual. And I guess we can see that clearly displayed in the life of the family, where the family is itself, although not a perfect society, as you point out, it's a society that antecedes the state, and that is a necessary building block, both logically and really, of the state. And therefore, one of the duties of the state in regard to the family is to protect it, to protect its integrity. And that, for instance, laws allowing divorce are contrary to the natural law and therefore contrary to the common good. So could you speak about that, about how the life of the family connects to the common good of society at large?
Yes. Well, as you say, as Leo XIII talks about very eloquently in some of his encyclicals, the family is prior to man entering into civil society, and that's why the family has rights which are antecedent to any human law and can't be taken away by any human law. So the right of procreation and education, for example. And then even more fundamentally, the fact that what the family is not determined, what marriage is not determined by human law, but by natural law. And so the temporal power is just incompetent to, it just has no competence to redefine marriage or redefine the family. I'm not sure whether this is getting to your.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. That's very helpful, and I know how orderly a mind that you have, and you're probably thinking, well, we wrote a whole chapter on the family, and it's broken down into X number of theses. Which one do you want me to talk about? I gave you a very general, but let's talk about the concept of hierarchy. Why don't we do that? So in any society, you have a concept of hierarchy. There is the concept of authority, which is there to work for the common good. And that, of course, exists in the life of the family, so that there is in every family a genuine hierarchy. So nowadays it's not popular to say so, but you show in the book, and you quote good authorities, that the father is indeed the head of the family. And I think it's easy to see that I'm reading another book right now, not yours, but in reading it in tandem with yours, it's very interesting, because the point that this author makes is that a lot of these new atheists, these surly, truculent, arrogant new atheists, such as Mr. Dawkins and Mr. Hitchens and company, a lot of these guys were fatherless. They had either weak fathers or no fathers. And there's a Catholic psychologist, Dr. Paul Vitz, whose thesis is that these men kind of, and I don't think this is Freudian, but it might sound to some like it's Freudian, because these men had such poor experiences with their fathers, they came to kind of hate the idea of fatherhood, and therefore the ultimate father, him after whom all paternity in heaven on earth is named, God, is rejected. Is all the more obviously we're not determinists, and we don't think that this is a fatalistic process, but certainly it was we could conceive it as an influence in these people's lives. So when you damage the institution of fatherhood, you are damaging the way that we conceptualize our relationship with God Himself, aren't you?
Yes, that's a very good point. I mean, I think authority is actually something which is, I would say this in the book, it is actually something which is spontaneously loved. So people like to go, in England, to stand out in the street when there's a royal wedding and wave a flag, and that's a very deep instinct. It comes from a deep understanding that authority exists to bring those who are under it to a good end. That's its only justification, and so authority is only authority insofar as it is bringing people to a good end. And if those who are the bearers of authority try to use it against the purpose for which they have been endowed with it, then they no longer need to be obeyed, and sometimes indeed should not be obeyed. And the family and temporal society are similar in some ways, and in the sense that they're both what we call natural societies. And I think this is one of another of the themes of the book, that there is a distinction between a natural and a voluntary society. And this is something that is basically contrary to the social contract doctrine that's been dominating political philosophy ever since Hobbes and Rousseau. And I think this is really key to understanding the Catholic way of thinking about the world, is that some societies are natural. That means that they've got ends which are built into them, not by the decision of the people who have made those societies, but by the will of God. So the family has got an end and has got a structure of authority which just is written into it, part of its DNA, as people say nowadays. And likewise, temporal society, there is a purpose for which temporal society exists, and we can't do anything about it, just like we can't change the nature of water. And that's different from all other societies. Like we can found voluntary societies for playing table tennis, or for playing table tennis and making cheese, or any other combination of ends that we might want to combine. But they would be voluntary. They would be set up by a decision, and we would be giving them their ends. And the family and temporal society are different. We don't give them their ends. And if we want to be happy, then we just have to accept that they have the ends that they do, and do our best to reach them.
Now, why don't we shift a little bit and talk about law and law and as a preserver of the common good, and indeed what law is. So I have to admit, I haven't actually read your chapter on law yet. I apologize. But I'm recalling that St. Thomas's definition of law has 4 notes to make it truly a law. It has to be an ordinance of reason by him who has authority in the community for the common good and promulgated. I note that because today, when we think of law, we all think in terms of legal positivism. What is sort of the diktat of the legislator or the diktat of the lawmaker? And laws change all the time. And in the United States, we have this insanely large body of laws. And I think if our lawmaker, if our rulers ever came to appreciate St. Thomas's definition of law, we'd have so many fewer laws on the books, because they would realize that in a good society you don't need as many laws. And that imposing all those laws on people becomes burdensome, because custom and our corporate memory is something that's important to even know and remember the law so as to observe it. But can you talk about those 4 notes and how what the true Catholic conception is of law as contrasted from the common kind of positivist conception we have in our day?
Yes, well, ultimately, to be a law at all, something has to be just. If it's not just, then it's just, as St. Thomas would say, an act of violence. And that means that anything that we call law in our societies has got to be in some way based on the natural law, which is something which is our participation in divine law. That's to say, God understands what human beings are for, and he has, by creating us as intelligent beings, he allows us to participate in his understanding of what human beings are for. And that participation is called natural law. And so when we come to write down laws, there are 2 ways in which those laws that we might write down are related to natural law. One is, and this is the more important one, is just a recognition in which we don't take any initiative to legislate, really. We just recognize what the ends are for which we are made, and we conclude, oh, well, in that case, we have to act in this kind of way. So, for example, we recognize that we're made for life and society, and therefore we conclude, oh, well, therefore we mustn't kill the innocent, or we mustn't take away other people's property. So that's what St. Thomas would call conclusions from natural law. We just recognize the kind of beings we are, and we conclude what we have to do or what we have not to do. And in that sense, we're not really acting as legislators. We're just discerning what the law is. So the other kinds of laws are those where we need to decide to do something or other. We need to determine a question one way or other, and it's indifferent in which way we determine it. So an easy example that's often used is, what side of the road do we drive on? We need to have some kind of determination, but it's apparently indifferent whether it's left or right. And so we decide to drive on the left. Well, I believe in some countries they've made another decision. I don't know why.
That's right. Yes, we have indeed.
So, and in those indifferent cases, we are actually legislating. We are acting as legislators in our own right. But they're the much less important matters.
So as you point out, this is a matter of indifference. I mean, there's no natural law as to which side of the road we should drive on, just that we don't crash into each other. So as long as there's a convention that's respected, then we'll be fine.
Exactly.
Okay.
But unfortunately, the idea, as you say, the idea that all human laws, in order to have any validity, in order to deserve the name of law, have to be based on natural law ultimately. That's something that's been lost. I can't remember which French president it was, but there was a French president not too long ago who said there is no law above the law of the state, and that's a perfect encapsulation of the wrong view.
Yeah, and not surprising, of course. You're listening to Reconquest on the Crusade Premium Channel, part of the Veritas Radio Network. This is Brother André Marie interviewing Father Thomas Crean, the Dominican friar, on integralism and the common good of the community. Now, so we have this false conception of law, which is basically legal positivism. It becomes kind of the diktat of the legislator or of the ruler, as opposed to being necessarily an ordinance of reason for the common good as well. I think even in the church we've cut the definition of law kind of in half, not officially, of course, but just the way that it's approached. The law becomes sort of the will of the superior, instead of it's for the common good, and it is. Well, of course, it has to be promulgated, but it's a dictate of reason for the common good. It has to be reasonable, and it has to be truly something that's going to attain the common good. Would you agree with me that even in the church, even a lot of canon, and I'm not asking you to attack any canon lawyers, but I think a lot of canonists are legal positivists as well in our day?
It's very easy to lose sight of the idea that superiors are limited in their authority, precisely because they can often find ways of getting their way even when they are not within the bounds of their authority. But every human superior has a limited authority, and his authority is limited by the good for which it exists. And if he commands something which is clearly not for the good end, then even if he really wants it, it's not a law. It's just the appearance of a law.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Sort of a simulacrum of law, but lacking the necessary nature of a law.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, let's shift a little bit into the doctrine of the two swords. You spoke earlier on about the Catholic position being the mean between two false extremes, one where the church and the state aren't distinguished at all, and the other where the church and the state are separated, or I should say the temporal and spiritual orders are separated. The true Catholic doctrine expressed, I believe, best, or at least the first best expression of it, was by Boniface VIII in his Unum Sanctum, spoke of the two swords. Could you speak to that and explain what the two swords are?
Yes. So this is a analogy that goes all the way back to the Gospel. A very mysterious passage in the Gospel of St. Luke at the Last Supper, when our Lord says to the apostles, when I sent you out without purse or bag, or did you lack anything? And they said nothing. But he says, but now that he that has a purse, let him take it. And likewise a scrip. He that has not, let him sell his coat and buy a sword. And the apostles say to him, Lord, here are two swords. And he says, it is enough. Now, that's a very mysterious passage. And at least for several hundred years, I think no one was terribly sure what to make of it. If you read the Fathers on this passage, they don't say very much about it. And it's not really until Christendom is thoroughly set up that you get a deeper reflection on this passage, and especially from Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, as a doctor of the church in the 12th century. And he says the church has these two swords, one of which is the spiritual power, and the other of which is the temporal power. And that ultimately, only ultimately, both of them are in the hand of the Pope. And what he means by that is, and what later theologians like St. Thomas and St. Robert Bellarmine, what they mean by that is not that the Pope should be usurping temporal power all over the world and telling kings and presidents how to run their countries, but that the temporal ruler in Christendom who abuses his temporal authority by refusing to use it for the good of the church and the salvation of souls can have it taken away from him and given to a more worthy person. So that in a nutshell, I say, is the doctrine of the two swords.
Okay, so and this happened sort of in that war between Pope Boniface VIII and Philip the Fair in France, right? He was rebuking Philip the Fair for exceeding the bounds of his jurisdiction, because he was sort of cutting into the power of the church.
Yes, he was, if I remember correctly, Philip the Fair of France was refusing to allow the proper taxes to be paid to the Pope. Is that correct? Was that the immediate cause of the dispute?
That was part of it, and also I think judging clerics was part of it as well. I think there was a question of clerics being subjected to the civil law, whereas they would have been under the immediate authority of the church courts. Okay.
Yes, so Boniface VIII was warning the King of France that ultimately the King of France's power, his temporal sword, to use the analogy, was subject to the spiritual sword, and so it could be taken away from him if necessary for the good of souls. But it has to be a clear necessity for the good of souls. It's not something that the Pope can just decide to do on a whim.
So in the integral Catholic society that we would like to have when the new Christendom comes, that we'd like to see come here, a society in which it would be, in a sense, easier to save your soul, because the society itself would be ordered to that. Divorce wouldn't be the common thing that it is. Pornography wouldn't be all around us. But there would also be an economy, and by that I mean I don't mean economy in the general sense, but in the specific sort of financial sense. There would be an economy that would also be just. So you wouldn't have usury, right? You wouldn't have a society run by sort of the banksters and Wall Street. People wouldn't be paying this burdensome and crippling compound interest on loans like they are now, right?
Yeah, that would be a very important important part of it, and also the paying of a living wage. So the purpose of work is to enable a man to support himself and his dependents. And if you are only paying someone enough that their spouse also needs to work, then you're not paying them enough. You're not giving them the reward of their labor. Then that's obviously crucial from a moral point of view, because the temptation to use contraception is huge in a society where there is not a living wage being paid.
I believe that your fellow English Dominican friar, what was his name? He was a friend of Chesterton and Belloc.
Father Vincent McNabb.
That was a point that he made, wasn't it? Father McNabb made the point that if you don't pay people a living wage, if you're domiciling them in these grungy apartments in these crowded, dirty cities, they're not going to be able to live. There's nothing conducive there to living a moral life. It's burdensome, and they're going to be tempted to contracept because they can't afford the children. They don't have the room for them.
Yes, right. Yes, back in the 1920s and 1930s, he was saying that the modern society is requiring heroic virtue of ordinary Catholics.
Mm-hmm. Which is a call to something higher in a sense, but it's also overly burdensome for your average person who's going to be driven to a sort of despair, or at least perhaps an apostasy over it, right?
Right. So these are not just sort of idle philosophical speculations we're talking about. We're talking about how to make it easier for people to save their souls, to go to heaven.
Mm-hmm. Well, which ultimately that's the true common good. Is our real common good is to be able to make our way to our common homeland to which we've been called by baptism.
Right. So the true, as we argue, the true human city is the heavenly city, and there God is the common good. He is seen face to face by each of the blessed, and each of the blessed also loves the heavenly city more than himself. So in that sense, also the common good is manifested as greater than the individual good in the heavenly city.
And you, towards the end of the book, you speak in terms of charity and how charity is the I believe you speak of charity in these terms. Maybe it was another source that I was reading. There's a website called the Josias, and I was reading something on there today about the common good and how St. Thomas talks about the theological virtue of charity, both in terms of the temporal society, that this is the ultimate expression here of our common good, is to show charity towards one another, and then of course, as you just said, in heaven, we love we love the mystical body, we love the communion of saints more than we love ourselves.
Mm-hmm. So one of the themes. Sorry, you want to say?
Well, so charity ties into this ultimately. It's right. It's the highest expression of the common good.
Yes. So exactly, because friendship is, and this is something we can only know by revelation. That friendship is a perfection that exists within God Himself. Because of the three divine persons
and the Trinity,
and therefore friendship is not just something, as we might think from our experience in the world without divine revelation. Friendship is not just something that we need to make up for our lacks, because we need help because we're finite or something. Friendship is a good in itself, and therefore to be expanded as far as possible. And that's why we are called to a city which bursts the bonds simply of let's say, of ethnicity, of ethnic kinship, or of cultural kinship. But that city is a city which is is based on charity, which is the city of God, which is on earth the Catholic Church. So the only way to break through the boundaries that separate nation from nation is by a love that is supernatural. So this is what is not understood by those who want to essentially ape the city of God by building an international community on earth, but without charity. Because if you don't have faith, you can't have charity. If you don't accept the Christian revelation, you don't have faith. So people who want to build an international community, civilization international community of friendship, but without Christian faith and charity, are attempting something which is impossible.
Yeah, the Tower of Babel.
It's only charity that enables us to break the bonds of the natural, that go beyond the natural bonds of kinship between members of the same ethnic group or culture.
Well, they're trying to build the Tower of Babel, and we're trying to do what the Holy Ghost did on Pentecost Day and unite all men into the true body where they can have a fellowship of charity, right?
Yeah, exactly. So it's very unfashionable in the church today, but there is a doctrine called the doctrine of the two cities, which is the name of one of the chapters in the book, which basically is a doctrine that there are already two cities in the world, and the history of the world, seen from the point of view of God, is the combat between the city of God and the city of man, or the city of God and the city of the devil. St. Augustine uses both phrases.
Well, Father, I'm afraid that we've run out of time, but I very much appreciate you taking the time. And again, the name of the book is Integralism, a Manual of Political Philosophy. It's available, and I'll have a link to it from the Reconquest.net page. Thank you so much, Father, and thank you, listeners. God bless, and Mary keep you.